find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on a thrilling...
Welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, what is our topic today?
How can improv improve your relationships? An interview with Andrew Davies.
We just finished that interview. What a fun interview, and what a fun guy.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of fun.
Yes, we did.
I just said the word fun 3 times, so fun, till Daddy takes your T-bird away. But no, that's Daddy's not going to take the T-bird away.
Daddy's not taking anything
We're just having
away.
fun. No, he's great. He's an improv guy, especially in the Jewish world, but actually also in the corporate world.
Right.
And we talk, of course, this being Couples Therapy in 7 Words, we talk about how that applies to relationships as well. And one of the things that came up several times in our conversations with Andrew was your book. So let's talk about your book.
Yes, The Blue Tent, by Erotic Tales from the Bible by Laria Zilber.
Yeah. Let me spell that for people who are not watching.
Okay.
LARIAZYLBER. If you go to lariazilber.com, you will find all sorts of information, including some videos made by Laria herself, who looks a lot like you, except has blue hair.
Straight blue hair, I might add.
Straight blue hair, yes. I've never seen you and Laria in the same room before, but I have a crush on you both. What can I tell you? No, do check that out. And it comes up in the context, improv and midrash have a lot in common. Sort of the free association part, and your book really fits into that. So do get a hold of that book, and of course you'll check out the interview in a moment. Let's just put in a plug for my books while we're plugging books.
Okay, so we have the latest one, Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again.
That's the latest, and especially looking for reviews of that one, folks. And you know what? I'm going to put a little parenthetical note here. If you go to our website, ctn7.com, you will note that it is very easy there to sign up for my newsletter, Dr. Chalmers' newsletter. And if you do that, among other things, you will... the most recent one, as of the time we're recording this, I have a link on there, goes right to the review for that particular book. I would love it if we get some more reviews. So if you were watching this, if you're not watching or hearing this, then I guess that's sort of, you're not hearing this, are you? I love that little bit of, never mind. You know how I can get nerdy around things like that. Keep on going, yes. Anyway, please give it a review. Moving right along.
Moving right along, we have It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong.
Which also came up in our conversation
Yes,
with
it
Andrew.
did. Just amazing how all this stuff comes up.
It's funny.
And Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back.
Yes, indeed.
Which also came up.
It also came up. All of those things came up.
All those things came up because there is so much valuable information in all of our books.
I couldn't agree more. There we are. And we're not the only ones who feel that way.
That's
there
true.
are other folks who have said about each of our books that they're really helpful. So, get a hold of them. So, let's go on with our interview, and we'll see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Andrew Davies. Andrew is the Better Meetings Director of Artly Working, which uses improv and theater to help build stronger teams made up of happier people and higher performers. With training in improvisation from the Magnet Theater and facilitation from Georgetown University, Andrew is passionate about bringing his skills to strengthen company culture and people experience. His Better Meetings workshop helps teams to gather with purpose and play, designing and facilitating more effective meetings that people actually want to attend. Andrew is the co-founder of Characters, theatrical walking tours where the past visits you. He is also the co-founder of The Bible Players, a Jewish comedy team. When Andrew's not leading The Bible Players, he can be found making up songs with his toddlers, Miller and Oren, biking around Philadelphia, or leading a free tennis camp in the neighborhood. Andrew, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Thank you so much, Judy and Bruce, for having me here. I'm so excited to be on the show.
Well, we are delighted to have you. So we always like to start off with our guests asking, how did you get into the work you do? Tell us something about your own journey into this.
Absolutely. I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and really got into theater on and off at a young age, and at some point really transitioned to being full time. In fifth grade was my first real big role because the audition process was my teacher, Miss Aaron, giving us a note card and saying, "Do you want a big role or a small role, singing or non-singing?" And I thought about it and I was like, you know what? Big role singing. Why not? And I got to be Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. So that was really my
Oh,
first
wow.
stage appearance. I still think because I'm the only boy in the class that probably put big part singing. That's my guess. Because there was no
Could be.
audition process, no scenes, no singing. um,
But she
and
saw it in you. She must have seen the talent in you. Yeah.
she saw it in me. She saw it in me. And, I did a lot of theater in high school, in college. After college, I moved to New York City where I really studied improvisation at the Magnet Theater and
Mhm.
really found my love of improvisation, both as an art form and as kind of a way of life, of thinking about how we interact in our relationships and our friendships throughout our life. And I was also kind of teaching Jewish education. And so my worlds have been using kind of the Jewish values I was raised with and the Jewish education and the improv values and education that I learned to kind of inform all of the work that I do in the various ways.
Mhm.
Nice. We share that. I have a theatrical background as well and Jewish education background. So,
And actually, one of our kids, my second son, we're a second marriage, was my second son was a musical theater major and actually played Tevye in his in college, which was really sort of a I've always had this sort of love-hate relationship with that particular with that musical because it's beautiful, it's wonderful. And then I also remember my grandfather who grew up in a shtetl
Mm.
talking, well, really
he
not
wouldn't
talking.
talk about
He
it.
wouldn't talk. I mean, I remember in 1964 when Fiddler on the Roof came out and we were sitting around a Shabbos table and I asked my grandfather, gee, what was life like in the shtetl? And he gave me a look that just said, oh, don't go there. It was just awful. So, this sort of romantic view of it was also, but it's beautiful music. Anyway, there's my little Fiddler on the Roof story. So you've talked about, we of course are a podcast about relationships, couples therapy in 7 words. So you've talked about improv as a way of strengthening relationships. And I will mention, by the way, in one of my books, I have a whole chapter where I describe therapy as improv, at least the way I do it. So I'm curious,
Mm.
how do you see improv as improving relationships, and how do you make use of that in your own work?
Yeah, I think that improv is really getting back to the basics of what it means to be a good human and a good partner, whether it's your romantic partner or work partner or relationship, because improvisation is all about living in the moment and building things one step at a time, right?
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that happens in our lives, and especially in our romantic relationships, is we build up all these assumptions and all these things that we know about our partner or we know for sure. And we get out of being in the moment and being with them there. We say they always do this or they
Mhm.
always act like that. So
Yeah.
when they say one thing, our brain just jumps 10 steps ahead, right? Like, oh, I know what's going to happen next. You're going to ask me to do this whole thing, or you're going to give
Mhm.
me a hard time about, this work that I'm doing. So I think for me, improv, both in theory and in practice, is a way to like remind ourselves to really be in the moment, and to practice that. So for instance, when something happens in the moment, to think about in improv, we say that everything is an offer, right? When
Uh,
things happen, everything can be an offer. And so if your partner is sick, let's say, okay, that's not ideal, it's not great, but what is the offer there, right? The offer is for you to step up and show them that you can take on their responsibilities when they're sick. If they're usually the one that cooks or usually the one that picks up the kids from school, like you can step up and do that. In the same way, I think to remind us to really be playful with our partner is so important because life is full of obligations, commitments, responsibilities. My wife and I have two young boys that are 1 and 3 at the moment that we're recording. And so it's
Congratulations and
important.
my sympathies. What can I say?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah,
Yes.
we're going to sleep again one day, I'm
Uh-huh.
I'm excited for it.
I
Um,
guarantee they're out of your bed before they go away to college. I just thought I'd let you know. Just
right,
from
right,
experience,
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think for me, improv is like reminding me to connect with Molly in the moment and as a person, um, rather than seeing my partner as, the co-manager of our kids or the co-manager of our calendar, but to really remind ourselves like why we chose to be romantic partners in the first place, which is we like to play together, we love each other, and we're, best friends, right? And so improv lets us continue to find that play.
Yeah, play it. I've noted that often with folks when I'm working with couples that how important play is, and of course that sentence, "play is really important," is deadly. Do you know what I mean? It's like if you
Hmm.
focus on, "Are we having fun yet? Are we having fun yet?" It's deadly. But there's something about that's why I love the notion of improv. And of course way more about improv than either of us do, although we both played around with it a little bit. You much more than I think. But that the notion of yes and that
Hmm.
concept in improv of yes and do I understand that right? That's the basic rule, right? It's like you don't reject. Everything's an offer and you find some way to accept it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes and is really about saying yes to the idea, acknowledging the reality of the idea, and then adding on to it, right? So in the
Mhm.
context of improv, it means that if your scene partner establishes a reality, like they say, "Oh man, it's crazy to be on the moon," right? You say, "Yes, we are on the moon together. That's what's happening." You don't
Yep.
contradict that.
Hmm.
And then you add on to it. You say, like, yeah, I can't believe the spaceship isn't coming back for 4 years, right? So you add some
Uh-huh.
information.
Yeah.
Um, and I think in the context of life, I think where people get tripped up is thinking that you're saying yes to everything someone says, that you can never disagree. But I
Oh
think
yeah.
that's really not what it is, right? Saying
Hmm.
yes in our relationships means saying yes to that person's reality that they're establishing or that they're feeling, right?
Yeah.
So when your partner says, like, I am exhausted, like I can't deal with the kids right now. I'm exhausted. Can you handle them? Right? It's not saying like, no, you have to, right? It's saying,
Mhm.
yes, I acknowledge that you're exhausted. I hear you. I'm with you. And what can we do together to get through it, right? So it's
Yeah.
about accepting people where they are and accepting
Mhm.
that the information they give you is honest from them and is
Mhm.
truthful, right?
Yeah.
And kind of assuming best intentions of people, that they're
Right.
not trying to trick you into doing something. They are honestly telling you, I'm exhausted. Can you pick up the boys today? Right? Versus saying
Hmm.
like, are you just saying that so I can go get the boys? Right? That would be like saying no, like you're not
Hmm.
tired, go get them. Right? So I think that's how yes and comes in for me. And it's a small thing, but so powerful, right? In our relationships, um, to just pause. And when we notice our instinct to say no, to just kind of pause
Hmm.
and and think about what could be next, I think is so important.
Yeah.
And you work with groups as well, yes?
Yeah, so I work a lot with groups. So with Artly Working, we really work in the workplace with teams and with groups. And in the workplace, it is so common for people to not say yes and, right? For
Hmm.
people to jump to the no's, to jump to why that won't work, right? Someone says like, we should do a big karaoke night this Friday. And it's so easy for people to instantly be like, no, like, I don't want to do that, or no, that's too expensive, or no, that won't work. And yes, and is inviting you to just pause for a moment and say, yeah, okay, what if we did a karaoke night? And maybe, for people who aren't excited about karaoke, we could do a picnic next week, right? So it's asking you to like just take a moment and not shut down the idea, but say yes. And I think in the group context in the workplace, where this is really important, is when we're trying to problem solve and we're brainstorming solutions.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And if your instinct is to say no, why it won't work, which is a lot of our instincts, it
Sure.
can really shut down the problem solving before it even gets going, right? So a lot of times I say, let's just like, what if we said yes first and then we added on our own ideas? Even if your first instinct is like, there's no way that's going to work, right? To say
Right.
yes, just to try it. It doesn't hurt you to try it and then add on to it. One very simple improv game I love to do just to get people to notice their instinct to say no or be negative and say yes is called band names. Band names, because
Ah,
bands names don't really mean anything in their own right, right? Like think of like what's one of your favorite bands, Judy or Bruce? Do you have favorite bands that come to
the
mind that
The
Beatles,
are
of
Beatles,
course.
of course.
yeah, right? The Beatles. Amazing,
We're
right?
marking our generation here. We're boomers, the Beatles. Got to be the Beatles.
Well, I love the Beatles too, right? So the Beatles, we don't love them because their name is the Beatles, right? We
No.
love their music. If they called themselves the Turtles, we probably would love them just as much in the
There was
end.
another group, by the way. There was another group called the Turtles. So
Okay,
there
yes,
actually
okay,
was.
there you go. There you go.
I like
I
to.
like the
So.
Turtles too. Yeah, there actually was a group called the Turtles. I'm just saying.
Yeah, so the game band names is you just sit with one other person or with a group of three people, and you just take turns making up band names, and
Hmm.
all the other people are allowed to say is, I love it. Like,
Mhm.
and then say like, now presenting the Turtles, right? And if people don't have ideas, I'm like, just look around the room, right? So it can be like, like Slinky, right? And then other people will say, I love it. Now presenting Slinky, right?
The
And
improv benches,
Mhm.
something like that.
exactly. Yeah, the
Yeah.
benches, right? It's great. It's super fun. So I think that's a way, a game that I love to play, just to notice your instinct, even when it doesn't matter and it's not real, to kind of get negative quickly, right? Someone says,
Mhm.
Dolphin Surprise, and your brain goes like, that's a dumb band name. That's not a good one, right? So even just to notice that and force yourself to like pause and say, no, I love that. Dolphin Surprise. Sure. Why not?
Yeah, yeah. I've often noted with couples that when they first come in, my job is to be in yes and mode. They're
Mm,
almost always in no damn it mode. So that whatever the other person, and you already mentioned some of my favorite concepts around that. The people will come in so oriented toward feeling like, oh, there you go again. It's an old
mm,
story that has dominated them for good reason. It's another thing I will often point out with couples is almost always neither one of them is crazy.
mm,
And so they have good reason for feeling all those ways that are so difficult. And the big problem, and you said this as well, the subtitle of one of my books is Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong.
mm,
And the reason, and I point out in the book that applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong. It's the knowing. And you pointed that out. When you think it shuts down other realities. When you recognize that you think, and it's fine to think and feel and, have all sorts of perceptions, but not to know, not to reduce that down to ideology, because then it shuts you down. And then you can't do improv. You can't say yes and. So, a lot of that stuff really applies to the couples therapy work that I do.
right, right.
Yeah, one of your suggested questions is, do you need to be funny to do improv? Do you?
Mm. This great. You don't need to be funny to do improv, right?
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
First of all, I would say all of us are funny at times.
Hmm.
So I think anyone that says like, "Oh, I'm not funny enough to do improv," or "I'm not a performer,"
Uh-huh.
that's the negative part of your brain, right? Being negative on yourself. I think you are
Mm-hmm.
funny, but I think what's important about it is that the goal of improv itself is not necessarily to try to be funny. And
Hmm.
oftentimes when people first start doing improv, that's our instinct, right? Is like you're in a scene, you're like, okay, what joke can I make? What joke can I make? Right. And that actually can really ruin and derail improv, that really what improv is about finding truthful moments and building moments together and finding the funny through truthful moments, right? So
And what's
when,
funny is what's
yeah.
surprising. And you
Mm,
can't do that on purpose a lot, right? That feeling of being
right.
alive, that genuine intimacy tends to be either funny or sad or something, but it's intense precisely because it isn't planned out. Does
Right.
that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. You're looking for this sort of the surprises. You're like establishing the world and then looking for the surprises. And with improv, I think, the Upright Citizens Brigade is one of the famous schools of improv, which produced like Amy Poehler and Tina Fey and a lot of folks that people know. One of their things that they say in their approach is that you're trying to establish all the normal things about the world and then notice the one thing that's weird, right? They talk about how if everything was weird, the audience would just be lost, right? If everyone
Yeah.
has feet for ears and everyone is flying and everyone speaks with a Russian accent and everyone lives underwater, the audience would just be overwhelmed and confused. Whereas if like everything is normal except that everyone is living underwater, right? Then that becomes your fodder for comedy for the scene, right? Of like, pass me the cereal. Ugh, it's always so soggy, whatever it is. It's just like one thing changes it all. So I think a lot of people are scared, Judy, to like try improv because they worry that they're not funny. And I tell them, first of all, you are funny. And second of all, don't worry about being funny. Just try to be in the moment and be with your partner and build one step at a time. Another improv teacher who I love said that improv is like walking on quicksand, and you each have to put down like one brick at a time to save yourselves from falling into the quicksand, right? So to think of it as like all you need is the next little brick. You don't need to build the whole house. You don't need to make the whole scene. You just need the next brick, the next little thing. And I think for relationships too, Judy, like Bruce and Judy, if you think, but I feel like that's part of it too, is that in relationships we get stuck in, I need to fix everything, or we've got 100 things wrong and we need to get into all of it today, when actually it's like, what's the next small step? What's the next little brick we can put to like reestablish our foundation or to reconnect as people?
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's so interesting when that moment happens, when people have the sense of, even if they're feeling like it's overwhelming, if they have this sense of, oh, I call it the oh shit moment, actually. It's one of my shticks is I have shticks like a bad Borscht Belt comic, one of my shticks is the oh shit moment, and it's not an aha moment. Aha moment is like, oh, we've solved it. The oh shit moment is, oh shit, no wonder. I see where you're coming from, and I see where I'm coming from, and no wonder we're having this problem. Doesn't solve it yet, but they stop squabbling at that moment. It's this moment of validation. It's this very intense moment of intimacy. It's like, oh wow. And then you can actually get someplace. And sometimes it's funny.
Right.
Sometimes it's sad. You never know, but it's never planned. You
Mm.
can't plan it out. And it's, again, I think that the improv approach is a way of facilitating. You can't make peak moments happen. You can make fertile ground for them. Like for people who daven every day, or
Mhm.
pray, and for the non-Jews listening who don't know the word, or the non-Yiddish speakers, um, it's not like you're going to have a peak experience every time, but you can lay the groundwork so that occasionally it might happen, and that's often what couples therapy is about.
Hmm.
I'm guessing that's what
That's
improv is.
improv too, I would think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's creating the space for being in the moment and having those experiences, right? I think, a breakthrough for my wife and I a little while ago was seeing a content creator's video about date night, and this is often like advice you get as couples is to like make time for date night. Make sure you're
Mhm.
making time for date days or date nights, whatever it is. And for Molly and I think, when we had our boys, that became infinitely harder, right? Once we had our two boys around, I'm like, how in the world do you do this, right? Like,
Mm.
trust the babysitter, plan with the babysitter, plan the event, plan the thing. And we saw this couple, I wish I could give them credit, but they're somewhere on the line, who said that they do a date night every week. And what they mean by date night is actually usually just that they stay at home and they like ignore the pile of laundry and ignore the dirty dishes and just sit with each other for a little bit of time. And
Mhm.
so now, for the last year or so, Molly and I, every Wednesday night, we really try to take an hour or two and like ignore the dishes, ignore the laundry, ignore the kids' books and toys all over the floor, and just to
Mhm.
sit with each other without screens and just have that time together. And
That's
that
nice.
has really been transformative, just that we can lower the bar of what it means to like have a
Yes.
date night versus having this idea that we have to like get dressed well, go out dancing, go to, go see a show, and that's the only thing that counts as a date. It's like, no, it's about making the time, right? The time for each other.
I'm totally gonna steal that. That
Yeah,
that is
please.
because it's, what I really love about it, and the concept of, as you said, lowering the bar and still calling it date night. That's the part that's
Mm,
new to me. It's like, yeah, wow, because everybody says do date night, and I always laugh about
right.
that. Yeah, I suppose you're like all those other crazy parents that not only had children but actually care about them. See, that's your problem.
Right.
If you didn't care about them, if you just let them kind of raise themselves, then you'd have a lot more time. But
That's true.
you have this weird tendency to want to care about your children.
I'm
And so
attached. Yeah.
it does tend to cut down on time when you have little ones, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
But no, that concept of still calling it date night, even though you're home, you're just not worrying about the stuff that you can ignore.
Mm,
Yeah. And you're still dealing with your kids, but especially after the kids are in bed or something, you have a little time to just sort of sit,
Sit and connect
and you
and
can still call
make
it
that
date
time
night.
for each other. I like that.
Yeah. That's neat.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
you might realize from well, we corresponded a little bit, and our viewers and listeners, if they know the word midrash, which I suppose we should explain, know that we are both consumers and practitioners thereof. And And you are too, clearly, in terms of improv and the Bible players. Could you tell us about the Bible players and tell us about how you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so midrash for folks, if they don't know, we could define it different ways, but I would say it's our interpretations and stories building off of the biblical stories in the, Jewish rabbinical tradition. So to a little bit about my journey, I was raised in a conservative Jewish household celebrating Shabbat. My mom grew up Orthodox, and my father grew up Christian in Texas, and was very happy to raise me Jewish, especially when my grandparents were willing to pay for Jewish school, which was amazing. And so
Wow, that's a
my
deal.
dad was like, a good education? That sounds amazing.
Uh-huh.
Um, I think I loved the part of Judaism that I always really loved is that Judaism really invites you into the conversation. I'm not an expert on other religions, but my understanding from some other Christian denominations and religions is that, it's a little bit of like top down, here's what the Bible means, the priest shares that with you, in some Catholic communities it was in Latin, like you're not even really encouraged or invited to read it or
Oh,
interpret it.
and indeed, that's what got the early translators, of the Bible into various vernaculars, got some of them executed, was the very fact that you weren't supposed to read the Bible. You were supposed to just get the interpretations from the priests. So yes, indeed, the Jewish tradition is quite different with respect to that.
Yeah, so the Bible players and this work really started when I was doing Jewish education and working with students both at religious schools and at Jewish summer camps and doing improv comedy at night. And I started to, in my mind, feel like these were in perfect conversation with each other, the values of improv and the values of Judaism. And I felt that no one was kind of bringing these worlds together. So, for example, like we talked about the idea of yes and, I think that rabbinical Judaism, which is what we all think of as Judaism, but really post the temples being destroyed a couple thousand years ago, is really a never-ending game of yes and,
Mhm.
right? The
Yeah.
rabbis are saying yes to the Torah, the books in the Bible and the greater Tanakh, and they are adding on their own midrash, their own interpretation, their own stories, their own interpretation of what the laws mean. And we are invited in modern times to read the Torah and also to read the rabbis, and we're, I think, pushed and encouraged to not say like, no, Rashi doesn't know what he's talking about, but to say, yes, Rashi said that, and I think this, right? You
Mhm.
know, like I think one, modern example is that, Purim is coming up in about a month, which is the story of Esther, Megillat Esther, the book of Esther. And Vashti is this queen at the beginning of the story who gets either kicked out or beheaded, depending on how you read the text. And in classical Judaism was always kind of vilified as a villain, as, a terrible person. And I think has been reclaimed in the last 50 years or so by Jews to say Vashti was actually a proud feminist warrior. She was Ruth Bader Ginsburg fighting for equal rights
Yes,
in this
as
ancient
as
text, right?
as we see now.
Yeah, and so in that way, we can go see these ancient texts, say yes to the old interpretations, and add our own. So I think that was a big part for me. The other big part, the connection I see between Judaism and improv, is our most famous kind of Jewish prayer is the Shema, which some Jews say every morning when they wake up and go to sleep. It's just a few words. It's Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, oh God, uh,
O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
the Lord is one. Yeah, I was debating how to translate it. So thank
Right.
you, Judy. That's great. Um, and the key word there, right, is the beginning is Shema, is hear, is listen, and how important listening is, I think, to Judaism and
Mm,
central to how we see ourselves as Jewish people, as being listeners, taking in the community, being a part of the community, listening. And for me, improv is really all about listening and all about seeing ourselves as listeners first and speakers second. And coming back to what we were talking about do you need to be funny to do improv? I think people often think that improv and comedy is about speaking, and I would argue it's actually about listening. That the greatest
Yeah.
improvisers are actually incredible listeners. And the reason they can be so good at improv is because they listen and hear not only every word, but the emotion behind it, the nuance, the details. And you can tell me, but I wonder if in our relationships, the better listeners we can be, the more we can hear, right? The more we can hear the words our partner is saying, but also the emotion behind it or the bigger thing behind it, right? Because often I feel like our fights, my most recent fight with my wife was about like, why did you put the extra pasta over there, right? It goes over there. And I
Ah,
was
the
like,
dreaded pasta fight. Yes.
yeah, the pasta fight, right? Um, and what I knew behind it or what I heard behind it is like we're trying to, keep our spaces a certain way so that like we know where things are. And when we put
Right.
things other places, we don't know where they are. So it's being able to like hear what's behind it. It's not really about the pasta, right? It was about some other values. So there's a few things that I feel like Judaism and improv kind of have in common.
Mhm. Are
Yeah.
you familiar with Amichai Lau-Lavie and storytelling?
Yes, I love storytelling and lab shul. I've worked with
Uh-huh.
Amichai and with
Uh-huh.
storytelling yeah, years ago. I lived in New York for 10 years. And
Uh-huh.
so about 5 of those years I worked with their team and I still follow and love everything they
Yeah.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, I did a workshop with him many, many years ago when he was, I guess, not starting out. It was already established, but I don't know, like maybe 20 years ago. That was a lot of fun. So
Yeah,
when
there's
I
a
saw the Bible
documentary.
players, I thought of that.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen or know that there's this documentary out now about Amichai and his work called The Sabbath Queen.
I heard
Um,
about it, but I haven't seen it. I'll
yeah,
check that out.
Hmm.
yeah, definitely, definitely do
Yeah.
it.
So, what do you do with the Bible players? Like, how do, where do you go and what do you do with folks?
Yeah, so with the Bible players, we really visit Jewish institutions, so really religious schools, day schools, camps, synagogues, and we do programs for really ages 5 to 105. Sometimes I say babies to boobies. We
Hmm.
have kind of a family Torah comedy show that we probably do the most, which is about an hour where we share 1 to 2 biblical stories around a Jewish theme. And then we do what we call mitzprov or improv to explore meets vote to kind of unpack the stories. And then we do with, high schoolers and up, we do workshops, building parody songs. We have one called Parody Hilarity, where we create parody songs around either holidays or Jewish values. And we have our unkosher comedy show, which we do for adults, which we say is like rated resh, which is R in Hebrew, and involves a lot of fun bits like kosher sex positions and awkward moments in the Bible and
Uh-huh.
fun things like that. So it's all about really using improv and comedy as a way to explore Jewish values and build Jewish community, I would say.
And we're in the presence of an author of biblical erotica. So,
Well,
biblical
Yes.
midrash.
I call it sexual midrash, actually. So
Oh,
that's for those listening. This is the blue tent, which you'll hear in the intro of the program. Yes, that's exactly what I call it's taking all the stories and just filling in all the sexual details.
And
Because, like you
yeah,
said, those stories are in there anyway. So
yeah,
definitely.
you didn't really make up much. You
no,
filled in lots of detail. But it's either there in the
it's
original
midrash.
text or it's there in rabbinic midrash,
And actually, I used a
yeah,
lot of the midrash in telling the stories. So
yeah, yeah.
you'll
Well,
Yeah.
some of
enjoy it, I
the
hope.
yeah.
And if you do
No, I
have
love that. I
a
definitely want to
five-star
read the
review.
Blue Tent. Yeah.
The Blue Tent,
So
erotic
excited.
tales from the Bible.
So excited to read it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, it's interesting when you're describing that sense of Judaism and improv. And I was thinking as you're just saying it, the entire Talmud is a bunch of arguments where they do record even the arguments that they ultimately say, nah, we're not going to go that way. They still record it because the argument itself, and it's all about listening. It's about honoring those arguments, even when you're still going to say, well, we're not going to go that way, but you've got a point. That sounds to me a lot like improv. There's a lot of yes and involved
But
in that.
also that's important in couples relationships too, because if you can listen to the argument, and even though you might be wrong, it's still valid.
Hmm. You're coming from
Yes.
somewhere
Yeah.
that's important, precisely because I'll bet you're not crazy. It starts from that. And, our 7 words of our podcast, and yeah, we have it on we have merch. Yes.
On a
Hold
mug.
it,
I
hold
love
that up
it.
closer so
Yes.
you can see it. There we go. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And really, the have faith part is I'm not talking necessarily about any sort of specific religious faith. One of the elements of have faith is you're probably not crazy, that there's something right about this, even when we're wrong. There's something that we're coming from somewhere valid. And the be kind part is a sense of, well, you know what, we really are kin. And you were talking about that earlier when you're recognizing, wait a minute, yeah, I forgot exactly how you said it, but you're not out to get me. If you're upset
Right.
about something, there's something I better listen to here. And the don't panic is how you manage to listen. Because if you're in panic mode, listening shuts down completely. So it might be uncomfortable, but if you can tolerate the anxiety and not panic, then you can still be kind. That we often suggested a drinking game in our podcast where every time I say the phrase "tolerate the anxiety," if somebody takes a shot, they'll be drunk by the end. But anyway, it's one of my favorite phrases. But I did not make that up. But then if having faith is the antidote to panic, basically, that basic sense of, well, I don't understand where you're coming from, but there must be something important there. So rather than panic or try and shut it down, I'll actually try and listen. And
Yeah. Just to build on that, I love that of yeah, tolerate the anxiety and don't panic. I One of the reasons I love improv as a tool, as a modality, is that you get to practice panic inducing moments that are
Mhm.
actually low stakes, right?
Yes,
So
they're
when
fun,
you're
right?
having therapy with your partner, right? And this is your person, maybe you have kids together, maybe you've been together for 10 years, it can feel super high stakes, right? And hard to play or in that moment. In the same way, when you do improv and you do a scene, I guarantee you, I mean, I remember feeling this in my first improv classes. You're in a room, you're with 10 other people. They all are there to do improv. They're all beginners. None of them are good at improv yet. And yet you still put all this pressure on yourself and you feel this panic of like, oh, the scene isn't going well. What are we doing? Right. And so to get comfortable in that anxious feeling or in that uncomfortability, is so great to practice that when actually it's super low stakes and to remind
Mhm.
yourself, I'm going to be okay, right? I'm going to be fine. For a couple years in New York, I was on an improv team, a musical improv team called The Commotion. So every Tuesday night, we would do a half hour show. We would get a word from the audience and we would make up a half hour musical, right? And this is kind of a crazy, terrifying prospect because you're taking one word. I remember one show was like tuna fish was the word, right? And now we've got to make a half hour
Well, that,
show.
that starts off funny. I mean, tuna fish is funny.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
funny
dude.
concept, right? Already, but
Yeah.
yeah.
If I remember it right, the show ended up being about like two tuna fish that like lived at a sushi restaurant and they were terrified of being taken out of the tank and so they escaped and like went on an adventure. But it's really about um playing and being comfortable with failing too and realizing you'll
Mhm.
be okay, right? I think that's
Yeah.
another big part of it is that we are scared, we're so scared of failure that it's hard to try sometimes, right? I'm
Oh
sure
yeah.
Very
I'm sure
true.
like a lot of couples that you work with, Bruce, tell you like we've thought about this for years, but we were scared to even
Oh,
start. We're scared to have these
Absolutely, yes.
conversations.
Yep, that is very much the way it goes. And as you point out, yeah, the stakes there are very high. And is it what is that? I saw some statistic to the effect that performance anxiety, like on stage, that sort of performance anxiety is
Yeah.
like the number one phobia, something like that. I mean,
Mm.
people fear death less than that.
yeah,
And
speaking
Yeah.
in front of people.
speaking in
Yeah,
front of
yeah, yeah.
people, yeah. And
Yeah.
so to do improv is to indeed, jump off the roof without jump off the building without a net, and yet really the stakes are low, especially like you say, you're in a room with 10 other people who are all doing it and they're all beginners. But it takes a certain amount of courage to even try that. And I
Yeah.
think that's, it's inspiring when you see people do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was an old Seinfeld joke that he said, the number one fear is public speaking and number two is death, which means people would rather be in the coffin than giving the eulogy, which is is a great
Absolutely.
way to
Yeah.
put it. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's so important. And I'm working on a book project right now, hoping to come out next year called Participate. And the
Mm,
reason I'm using that word is because I think so often the most important thing is just jumping in and participating and not worrying about things being perfect. So, like you're saying, with the fear of public speaking or the fear of these difficult conversations can just prevent us from even trying, from even jumping in. And
mhm,
so for me, it's about thinking about how can we lower the bar for participation so that people can get their foot in the door, start the conversation, start the activity, start trying, and find that maybe it wasn't so scary after all. And if it was scary and terrible, you can always walk away from it, right? But as we were talking about like date nights, right? I think for me, lowering that bar for participating in what we're calling a date night just made it so much easier. And it feels so special. Like we literally just pick a drink, either a mocktail or a cocktail we're gonna make, and then we sit on the couch. And that's our usual date night,
Sounds
And it's
wonderful.
great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and it's like it's great because we're just making a ritual of it. And I think
Mhm.
that's so important. We're so often we jump to stage 10 or just are scared of the outcome, and so we don't
yeah.
even try. And also sometimes when we try, we find out that it doesn't work, right? And we wouldn't
Mhm.
find that out either unless we jumped into it. So, yeah.
As you're describing that, I'm thinking about what is it that lets people get over the fear of doing couples therapy, especially men. I did a whole video on how to get your reluctant guy to go to therapy because men, we as a group tend to be the ones that resist it. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I noted as you're describing this, the thing that makes the difference. I was just talking to a couple the other day where the guy was describing his experience trying individual therapy and it really helped him. And the number one thing that helped him was he was talking to a therapist who was validating him. Not saying everything he was doing is right, because he had doing some things that were profoundly wrong, actually, which he knew, but
Yeah.
just validating that he's coming from a valid place, and that realizing the thing that I'm trying to present more than anything else to the couples that come in, especially early on, is that sense of validation, which another word for which I call faith. It's like, okay, well, we're all valid in this. We're all valid to be who we are, even when we screw up royally. And when people experience that, that's when they can relax a little and then they can actually hear each other. Then they can actually sort of get into the improv mode. But it really does take that sense. I love that idea you're saying, like lowering the bar. When you're working, I'm imagining in a corporate context, for example,
Yeah.
to be able to present, I'll bet a lot of people, I'm imagining, I haven't done much work in corporate context. I was in academia for years, for a long time ago, but I would imagine going into some of that with a lot of fear. It's like, oh no, how am I going to look? How's this going to be? I'm not funny, whatever. And I'm imagining one of the things you're offering people is that very sense of, hey, the bar is low here, just participate and have fun, right? That's kind of what you're trying to present.
Absolutely. And oftentimes, coming in as an outsider, they
Hmm.
can shift their thinking just enough to jump in and participate, right? Whereas if their boss or their colleague brought in the same exact improv game or the same exact
Uh-huh.
day, they might push back against it. But, I'll say, like, listen, I'm nobody. You don't care if I think you're funny, right? You don't care
Right.
about me.
I
I'm just
can't
coming
fire
in.
you either,
Yeah, exactly. I can't
Yes.
fire you. I can't hire you. I don't even understand what you do for work. I'm just here to help you like play and communicate. And it's so important. One of the key insights I've noticed over the years is we do a lot of work with kids, with the Bible players and adults. The corporate world is mostly adults for good reason, not children. And when I ask for volunteers with kids, almost every hand shoots up like
Uh-huh.
before I even explain the game, I've learned I have to think about when I'm going to ask for volunteers because they don't hear
Uh-huh.
anything after the word
That's right.
volunteer, right?
I'll do it. I'll do it.
And with adults, it's the exact opposite, right?
Uh-huh.
Right.
Adults are terrified to participate. So when we do um, our corporate workshops or when I do like our adult unkosher comedy shows, I will befriend and talk to the adults before we ever start and talk to
Hmm.
them about the games we're going to play and ask them if they would be willing to participate in the game
Uh-huh.
before we ever start so that they feel really comfortable with it. I kind of hold their hand and like help them to get going. So with our adult comedy shows, at no point during them do I say, "Can I get a volunteer?" Because I know hands won't go up. Instead,
Uh-huh.
I've already got all my volunteers. Say, "Okay, the next game, I got Bruce and Judy are going to come up and play. Come on up to the stage," right? Because I've already talked to you about what we're going to do, what it's going to be. So I think it's just an important insight for us that we get really scared to participate as adults, even if nothing's really going to go wrong, right? And it's a really simple game. Some of our improv games are silent. Like we have one called Vacation Slideshow where I talk about a vacation I went on. I get a suggestion from the audience. Like I went to Hawaii or I went to France. And then all the volunteers have to do is freeze as the photos from my vacation while I describe it. Right. So they don't have to say any words. They don't have to think of anything. They can just go like this. Right. And I have to explain why they're freezing that way. But still, it's like hard for them to participate. So I think you know, helping to remind them of that is so important. Another of my kind of philosophies in my approach is that we need to treat kids more like adults and treat adults more like kids.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I remember years ago, and I was working in public school. Um, before the year started, our principal brought in somebody to do team building who was, a comedian along the lines of what you do, doing improv, doing comedy stuff, doing shtick. And, here we are, we're all teachers, we're all used to standing up in front of kids all the time. And it's like nobody wanted to do anything, but he did. He got us, really active. And he didn't even ask for volunteers. He said, "Okay, Kathy, come on up. This is what you're
Right.
doing." It's like not asking for any volunteers, didn't nothing like that. So he's like, "Okay, you come on up."
Which is interesting. That's what you might do with kids.
Right,
Yeah, so treating the
exactly.
adults like kids. Yeah, yeah. No, that I
Yeah.
love that idea, treating kids more like adults and adults more like kids, because there's a great deal each of those groups can learn from the other.
Mhm.
It's always fascinating to me when kids get this, kids are describing, especially like adolescents, describing the way they are treated, where they're expected to act like adults, but they are treated as if they have no agency whatsoever.
Right.
And it's no wonder they're in something of a double bind there.
Yeah,
Right.
it's also important to bring the playfulness into situations.
Oh yeah.
So that's, what you're doing.
Oh,
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
absolutely.
Kids will play. Well, those
Well,
those
kids
kids are
will play.
just automatically putting their hands up because they're in play mode all the time. When I
Right.
was trained in hypnosis, one of the things somebody pointed out, young kids are constantly in a trance state. What we would call a trance state. They're never in what we would call sort of adult non-trance reality. They're always in this thing where everything is free associated with everything else. That's why kids can just play easily, and
Mhm.
we lose that capacity. So a lot of what you're doing is bringing that back to adults in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a muscle, right? I think creativity and play is a muscle, and we forget to exercise it as adults.
Mhm.
Kids are just constantly playing, right? They're basically, if creativity is a gymnasium, they are just at the gym every day for hours, just like my 3-year-old son Miller, I got him this morning. We woke up from bed, and his first words to me were, Abba. I go by Abba's, Hebrew for dad. I go by Abba, and he said, Abba, could we have a flying car and we both drive our flying cars and we fly to school together, but I'll fly faster than you like this? And I said, sure, right? I was like, that's great. But that's what he was thinking about, that he was dying to tell me when I got him. Um, and as adults, I think we don't give ourselves the opportunity to play and like use those muscles at all. And that's what leads to the question of, I'm not funny, I can't do improv, or I'm not funny. It's
Mhm.
because we've like let those muscles atrophy in some ways, right? We haven't let ourselves play, because people often ask me like, Andrew, how do you improvise? How do you just make up things on the spot? And I say, well, I'm just practicing it all the time. And I've been doing it for like decades. I see someone playing the piano and I'm like, I could never do that. How are they doing that? And then you
Mhm.
ask them and they say, oh, I've been playing since I was 10. I like play
Yeah.
an hour every day. And I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, that's how you got there, right? So I think in terms of that participation, also, we often see the end product of a year or decades of work, and that's very intimidating. And so we don't even start. We don't even try because we're
Yeah,
like, I could
exactly.
never do that. So
Oh
it's
yeah.
it's jumping in at that first level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I blame Martha Stewart.
It's easy to blame Martha Stewart.
Well, because, she came on the scene and everything was perfection. And
Ah,
suddenly everybody had to do everything perfectly. And, you know, we don't have a staff like Martha Stewart. We didn't put in those 40 years of hard labor and toil to get to where Martha Stewart got. We just seeing her end products and like everybody suddenly wants to be Martha Stewart. And it's like, you can't.
yeah. Well, it's a basic principle is you have to be willing to suck. You have to be willing to not be good at something to get good
Yeah.
at something. And that's again, look at how kids learn anything, how kids learn language. They're not
Yeah.
worried about speaking correctly at first. They just speak. They
Yeah.
just go
Right.
ahead and do it. And because they're not worried about it, they can learn it incredibly fast. And as adults, we are so inhibited by all those things that, it's similar when people will say, I'm not funny, they'll also say, well, I'm not creative. And
Mm,
I think it's the identical muscle. It's not like those are two different muscles. They're the same muscle. To be funny, to
Yeah.
be creative, it's just to be alive, to be willing to be in the moment and not worry about whether it's okay or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think often people talk about like a gender divide in the comedy world and in comedy, like men and women. I think luckily in the last 20 years, we've had so many examples of unbelievably funny, amazing women, right? And I
Mm,
think the reason there is still a much larger quantity, right, of men or like percentage at comedy clubs, partly cultural things, partly a lot of discrimination and a lot of problems there. It's also partly just that, at least for me growing up and for a lot of men growing up, you are just constantly making jokes with your friends. That is like the
mm,
currency of your social life. So
Yeah.
by the time you're 20 years old, you've told 10,000 bad jokes, right?
mm.
And so you have like 100 good jokes. In the same way, and I'm curious for the therapy work, but I feel like women by the time they're 20 have had 10,000 conversations about relationships,
Absolutely.
10,000
Yeah.
check-ins about family.
Yep.
Whereas
Right.
for me, I like got to my 20s and I'm like, oh, I've had 10 of those, right? I'm so behind.
And you
And so
remember
it's,
all of them. They were terrifying.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And like, I'm curious if this rings true for you. This is an informal thing I've noticed as like a nugget that's, I think, exemplary of something bigger, but with movies, seeing movies. And you tell me if this is true for you, Judy and Bruce. For me, I can remember lines from hundreds of movies. I could quote you lines and moments from movies. If you ask me who I saw that movie with, I have no idea.
Ah,
No
wow.
idea.
Yeah.
And with
Uh-huh.
women, I found mostly like if I ask, I'll just like anecdotally ask, like, like who did you see, Barbie with? Right
Yeah.
away. They know when, who they saw it with. The relationships come
Yeah.
first.
Oh,
And
yeah.
for me, it's like the
So
the
true.
jokes come first or the moments.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
so true. So, yeah, I'm thinking, growing up, like my male friends, um, they could like recite every routine from Fire Sign Theater. They knew every lyric to every Tom Lehrer song.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just so true that they could
Department of
do
Redundancy
something
Department.
first, right?
Yes. Yes.
They would know the Monty Python routine. I mean, and it's like, we talked about things of relationships and people and emotions and our
Yeah.
parents and our lives with the girlfriends. But yes, the boys always knew all that and sports statistics too. So,
Right.
but yes, it was a very more knowing things as opposed to the relational
Yeah.
is what you're
Yeah.
talking
And
about.
couples therapy that really shows up, that very reason. That's why men are reluctant and women are more willing. Women
Yeah.
lean toward it because, yeah, yeah, you learned right early on.
Mm-hmm.
Little girls talk about relationships right from the get-go. Boys aren't doing that so much. So, and there's all kinds of evolutionary reasons, I imagine, why that is true. And so it tends to be feminine territory. And many of the couples I work with, the woman can talk rings around the man or about anything to do with emotions. Women have better language available. And I read somewhere, I think it's true. I believe it's true. I think women have, what is it? What do I always say? 20% more fibers in the corpus callosum than men do. So the corpus callosum is one of the main pathways between the two hemispheres. Women have a much larger, richer source of communication between the two hemispheres. Men,
Mhm.
it's less. So I'm sure I'm grossly oversimplifying here. The left-right hemisphere thing gets oversimplified greatly. I'm sure really everything's involved in everything. But
Right.
having said that, men tend to have a less, much not as rich a source of language about how we feel.
Mm.
Language is more left hemisphere, how we feel is more right hemisphere. We don't have words for that. And it's often surprising to women, I
Mm-hmm.
find. Women are often like, you don't even know how you feel. It's like, how can that be true? And of
Oh,
course, I'm
feel
I'm a
good.
guy.
Feel okay.
Yeah, we don't know. We know when we're pissed off, and we know when we're not, and we know when we're horny. But that's about it. And at least
Right.
in terms of what we can identify. And women,
Right.
it's like all these. It's you can see it. I remember a guy I worked with many years ago who was sort of sent by his wife, which is often the case when men show up in individual therapy. And I also had met the two of them together, and he said he worked in a office where it was almost all women and him and maybe another guy or so. But he said he would go in the break room and it would drive him crazy because the women would be sitting there. And what he said was, they keep saying the same thing over and over. It drives him nuts. They keep saying the same thing over and over. And what what I was noting was, well, they don't think they're doing that. You're not picking up what they're actually talking about. you're hearing similar words, but they're constantly negotiating their relationships. So it's not just the words they're saying, it's also how are we doing with each other? With men, it's like who's winning. With women, it's like, how's our relationship? Do you like me right now? Do I like you right now? Do we like the same people? How are we doing? And it's constantly shifting and changing, and they're always negotiating. I don't know.
Interesting.
Does that fit with your,
That fits pretty well.
yeah. Yeah, Deborah Tannen, you know that name? She's been on TV and some of those reality shows, like the ones about, I forgot the name of the show where they marry people off who just barely met, and we're not talking about a religious
That's a
context.
lot of them. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of them. But anyway, she wrote a book many years ago called, I think it's called You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation, where she described that. She talked about how when women are speaking, it's all about relationship. When men are speaking, it's more about who's winning. And when we men speak, it's not like, if we're of goodwill, we're not trying to make the other one lose, or damned if we're going to lose. And with women, it's much more nuanced than that, I think.
Yeah.
That's anyway. So yeah, that shows up a lot in therapy.
Well,
So-
thank you for this hour of improv. So
Yep, indeed. How can people get in touch with you and tell people how they can find if they want to work with you or tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they can check out either of the projects we've talked about, Artly Working, that's ARTLY working.com. You can email me, Andrew at artlyworking.com. And the Bible Players is thebibleplayers.com. And you can email me about that, Andrew at thebibleplayers.com. Would love for people who want to be in touch and learn more. If you have a workplace, would love to talk to you about programs. We have, if you email, I can share. We have a worksheet of how to do better meetings and gatherings, like a one-pager template that you can use, which I think is really valuable to share with people. And we unpack it in programs, but we're happy to just give that to you to try out and see if you can make better meetings. And always happy to talk about all of these programs. And I'll let you know next year when the book is available and can listen to that. So
I was going to ask you to do that very thing. Yeah, and we'll make sure to put those websites in the notes for this episode.
wonderful. And for those who are not seeing us, we all got the navy blue t-shirt memo.
that's true.
Yes, we did. By sheer chance, we all did. Go figure.
It's important in a podcast to all be matching outfits. That's the most important rule for podcasts. Yeah.
Yes, we rarely achieve that. So we managed to do it at this time. Well, thanks again, Andrew.
Yeah.
Delighted to have you.
Thanks, Bruce and Judy. Thank you both so much. Yeah.
Our pleasure. Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that interview with Andrew as much as we enjoyed our part in the interview with Andrew.
Absolutely.
It was a lot of fun.
So if you want to, what should people do if they want to suggest a topic or even suggest themselves as a guest? What ought they do?
They can go to our website, ctn7.com. CT as in couples therapy, in the numeral 7.com.
What a great idea, ctn7.com, where they will find actually various sorts of links. There's links where you can just contact us and tell us whatever you want to tell us. Comments, of course, feedback, argue with us, do whatever you like.
Topics you'd like us to discuss.
Yep.
Maybe you yourself would like to be a guest on this podcast.
And if you go, I think it's on the podcast tab, as I recall. Anyway, if you hunt around, you will find a link that takes you to our scheduling link. If you happen to be available to be interviewed on a Friday, that's all the schedulings. We do most of our interviews on Friday, so that's what I have available there. And you can sign up for a time. And when you do that, we'll ask you, what do you want to be interviewed about? And by golly, if you think you'd be a good guest, I'll bet you would be. And that's usually the case. That's a rare indeed. I don't think anybody's ever used that scheduling link whom we haven't gone on to interview. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, maybe you'll be the first. Who knows? Give us a try. And so until next time,
remember, be kind,
don't panic,
and have faith.